In the previous lesson, we went over the Bible's summary of creation, and in this one, we'll look at the detailed account in chapter 2, starting with verse 4, and then I will go back and analyze the two chapters together. As before, I will read my paraphrase while you follow along in the Greek interlinear, which is linked in the description. And I want to go through this fairly quickly and then go back and do the analysis of both chapters. And I'll probably spend a fair amount of time on chapter 1 since I didn't do that after the previous video. So here we go, Genesis 2, starting with verse 4. This is the book of when the sky and earth were brought into existence. On the day God made sky and earth, at first there were no fields of green plants, because the sovereign God had not yet brought rain on the earth, and there was no human to work the ground. But a spring came up from the ground and watered the surface. Then God formed the human out of dust from the ground. God breathed the breath of life into the human's face, and the human became a living soul. Then God planted a paradise in Eden toward the east, and there he put the human he had formed. Now God had caused the earth to produce every sort of beautiful fruit tree. In the center of the paradise grew the tree of life, and also the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There is a river that goes out from Eden to water the paradise, and from there it separates into 4 branches. The first river is called Fishon, forgive my pronunciations, which encircles the whole land of Havilah, a land of the finest gold and of red and green precious stones. The second river is called Gihon, which encircles the whole land of Ethiopia. The third river is called Tigris, which goes across from Assyria. The fourth river is called Euphrates. Now the sovereign God took the human he had formed and put him into the paradise to cultivate it and to guard it. The sovereign God then gave Adam this responsibility. You may eat from any tree in the paradise except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat from that tree, you will most certainly die. Then the sovereign God said, "It is not good for the human to be alone. Let's make a helper that will be his equal." Now God had formed out of the earth all the wild animals of the field and all the birds of the sky. So he led them to Adam to see what names he'd give them. Whatever name Adam called a living thing, that was its name. He named all the cattle, the birds of the sky, and all the field animals. But for Adam himself, there was no helper like him. So the sovereign God put Adam into a state of deep sleep. He took part of one side of Adam and attached flesh to it, and then built that into a woman. He presented her to Adam, who exclaimed, "Now this is my own flesh and bone. She will be called woman because she was taken from the man." This is why someone leaves his father and mother to strongly join to his wife, and the two are to be one flesh. Adam and his wife were both naked, but they felt no shame. Now let's go back and look at chapter 1. First of all, we see where the Apostle John got his opening lines for his gospel, including the contrast of light and darkness. In the beginning, God. What God made was, of course, not his own abode we call heaven, but the earth and sky as we know it. That these were not instantly made in their final forms. For whatever reason, God decided to create in stages. And the repeated pattern of evening and morning, day 1, evening and morning, day 2, tells us that literal solar days are meant, not long, undefined ages. I don't know how they could be more precise. The 10 Commandments even cite such literal days as the reason Israel was commanded to honor the weekly Sabbath. And the order of creation cannot be force-fit into evolutionary theory. It's the wrong order. The strong support, as I called the firmament, typically known by that name, or some people say the dome, or whatever they want to call it, is described simply as that which separates water above and on the earth. That's how the text describes it. That's all it does, and it's very strong. That's what the Bible means when it says sky. That's how it's defined in chapter 1. The sky is the firmament. The sky is the strong support that holds waters above the earth. So there must be waters there, but pay attention to what God says the sky includes. The sun, moon, and stars. Water is above all of that, and this is stated as true even after the flood in Psalm 148:4. And it seems from the narrative that there is one single landmass at that time. Can't be guaranteed or ruled out that there are other land masses, but it sounds like God gathered all the land into one place, or all the water into one place and the rest was land. It wasn't until day 4 that God made the luminaries, everything shiny in the sky, and stated their purposes. So what about the rest of what we call the universe during the first 3 days? For example, what was the Earth orbiting if we force creation week into modern cosmological theory? Where is any description of Earth's alleged movement? The stars are stated here as almost an afterthought. Yet modern cosmology makes them of far greater importance than the Earth. We should also note the absence of the so-called planets, which is a transliteration of the Greek word meaning wanderer. Transliteration means you simply port the letters from one language to a next without regard for the meaning of the word. And that's the Greek word planetes, which means wanderer. To the Bible, at some point in time, stars left their assigned places, some of them, and moved in relation to other luminaries, so these were referred to as wandering stars. That's what a planet is, a star that wanders. And that's all that Scripture in ancient Greek meant when it used the word planet. Notice also that the birds are said to fly under the sky. It seems in this context, at least, that the sky did not include what we call the atmosphere or air. It did expand to that meaning eventually, as when Jesus rebuked people for being able to read the next day's weather in the sky, but not for recognizing the signs of the times. But here, in Genesis 1 and 2, it is not considered part of the firmament. And another interesting detail is that many animals are described as living souls. And in the later account of the flood, they are said to have the breath of life in them, exactly the same as God would breathe into the first human. And I'm using these terms, human, person, because the Greek does. Anthropos means person. In Greek, the habit was that if a word or word referred to a group of people that could include both male and female, the masculine form of the word was used. So it is not an exclusively male term. It is not a term of exclusion. It's a term of inclusion. So it means people in general. And that's how I rendered it in my paraphrase. So animals, not all, but many, are called living souls with a breath of life in them, just like people. And of course, all living things produce after their own kind. There is designed adaptability in life, but only within limits. Nothing becomes another life form. This is never observed, but often presumed. The scientific method requires observation. They've done experiments with fast-producing life forms such as fruit flies, and all they ever got were fruit flies. They were mutated, they had extra wings or eyes or something like that, but they were still identifiable as fruit flies, specifically that kind of fly, not horse flies or dragonflies. So there's limitation within adaptability of life forms. And that's what the Bible means generally by producing after its kind. Also note that the Scripture never calls plants living, but only green, even though they too only produce after their kind, because eventually they wither. The Bible doesn't call it really death. And they're further described as food for all the other living things, including humans, the final creative act of God. Plants were for food. They weren't considered living things like everything else. Debate has long raged over the meaning of image and likeness when God did make the human being. But it has to mean something distinct from all other life forms. Why else use different terms? Now, things like sexual reproduction are not unique to humans. Neither is having 2 arms and 2 legs or lacking a tail. What makes us unique is our lack of instinct, our ability to think abstractly, and of course our ability to understand that we have a creator to whom we can relate. But beyond that, this passage indicates that we are also set apart in authority over the earth and all it contains. Look at chapter 1. That's how it describes people as being in the image and likeness of God, as we have authority over all other aspects of the world. Now, debate also rages over whether male flesh is portrayed in Scripture as having authority over female flesh. And remember, we're still in pre-sin. But such a concept is conspicuous by its absence here. Both are equally granted authority over creation, both male and female, but not one person over the other. There's no hint of human governance here or any inkling of marital hierarchy. There are many, especially today, who try to inject some sort of government or family order, meaning hierarchy to them, before sin. It's not there. It's just not there. Now let's move on to chapter 2. The first 3 verses are the ending statements on God's creative work, as we noted before. But it adds about the 7th day. But does the sanctification of the 7th day mean all the world is under the Sabbath laws of Moses? That would be extremely poor logic, namely an anachronistic fallacy, not to mention a severe twisting of Scripture. Nowhere is anyone, even the pre-Mosaic patriarchs, shown to be observing Sabbath regulations. If they had, there would have been no need for Moses to give the Israelites so much detail on how to observe it. So this statement existing before sin in no way says, observe the laws of Moses. I'll give you the details later. That's, again, reading into the text things that are not there and can't be put there by any right, and no New Testament writer puts it there. But remember, this is being written by Moses. Still, Moses is not backdating things that God told him. He is recording history here. Now, after this opening that belongs with the end of creation week, the end of chapter 1 actually, we see a slightly different wording for the beginning of creation. This is the retelling in more detail. Instead of saying in the beginning God did this and that, it says this is the book of the earth and sky being brought into existence. Now no one can say that Bible doesn't appear in the Bible. Just as a side note for a ridiculous argument, there's the word in Greek is biblos. That's where we get the word Bible, and it means a book, a collection of writings, whether they're scrolls or parchments or, a stack of things that we call a book now, typically known in academia as a codex. So there's that word, the book of the earth and sky being brought into existence. Now the book is going to actually start. After the opening preface, so to speak, which was chapter 1 and a little bit of chapter 2. Then we're given details about how the earth was watered at first, and after a brief mention of the creation of the first human, we're told about the Garden of Eden and the rivers flowing from it. And that's the picture I've had on the screen here. I won't be showing other images today. It's significant that they are described in terms that would only have meaning after the flood, such as the territories of Ethiopia and Assyria. Those didn't exist in Eden. It's often argued that the flood wiped out Eden and its original river system, but why would Moses then describe the rivers in terms of post-flood geography? The flood did wipe out a lot, but did it wipe out Eden or the river system? As far as Moses is concerned, it does not seem to be. Next, we're given more detail about the creation of the first human, who was given 2 primary tasks to perform: to cultivate and to protect the Garden of Eden. What need could there have been for a protection? First of all, we note that this is just prior to God giving the warning about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Such knowledge would certainly include understanding what at the time must have been quite puzzling, the concept of death. Because again, withering plants is not the death of a living thing. And this protection order was immediately followed by the statement by God, not Adam, that the human should not be alone. So look at where the statement about guarding Eden happens. It is sandwiched between 2 things the warning about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which some people erroneously shorten to the tree of knowledge, and it's immediately followed by the need for the human not to be alone. Surely there is more here than meets the eye. We're told in Romans 5:12 that there was no death before sin, so we can rule out carnivorous animals to protect against. And we can rule out invasive plants, since that too only came after sin, as we'll see in Genesis 3. Is this when the enemy, later known as Satan, was found to be sinful, since at creation all the angels shouted for joy, per Job 38:7? And is this why God said it was not good for the first human to be alone? Always be careful with speculation, though, and reading between the lines. Scripture does not tell us God's reasons for these things. And this will become even more critical when we get to chapter 3, as I will probably repeat then when I do that lesson. There are a lot of people who invent a phantom chapter, Genesis 2.5, where Eve allegedly had some issues going on that Scripture never, in any part, Old or New Testament, ever even hints at. So I just speculated here about why God gave a warning to protect the garden and when he gave it, and that these may be clues. But that's as far as I can take it. It is speculation, and that's all it is. Okay, we have to recognize when we're speculating, and we have to be very, very careful about that. But it's an intriguing thought, nonetheless. Going on to chapter 2, in chapter 2, we're already there, we're just going farther. Some say that God created animals at the time he brought them to the human, because in both Greek and Hebrew, the tense of the verb meaning to form seems to indicate it being done at that moment. However, at least in the Greek text, we see the word yet paired with formed, yet formed, yet formed, which together indicates something done earlier. Otherwise, we have a conflict with creation sequence as given in chapter 1, where the human was the last thing created. So how can God have brought animals to Adam if he already created Adam and then created animals and brought them to him? You have a problem if you make a second creation of animals. And I don't think it's necessary or demanded by the text. And speaking of creation sequence, we now come to the creation of Eve. Her being made last is often claimed to be proof of secondary status compared to Adam. But it is inconsistent to say, in the same breath, that humans are greatest in authority since they were created last. Remember that God created humans with authority over everything else that had been created before them. Well, Adam was created before Eve, so why doesn't she have authority? They reverse their rationale for order by sequence when it comes to Adam and Eve, and they do this without any warrant in either scripture or logic. And of course, God has never mandated authority on the basis of first to be made. That is a purely human construct, and one that only appeared after sin entered the world. If the Bible shows us anything about the times God does directly intervene in society, it is that he chooses the young over the old, the weak over the strong, the inferior over the superior, and the despised over the honored. This is stated explicitly in 1 Corinthians 1, verses 27 and 28. God's way is not preeminence by first come, first serve. Notice also that when Adam first sees Eve, and pay attention to the fact in the text that he is called the human, the human, the human, and then when the separation is to happen, there's Adam and Eve. Also, in at least Hebrew, Adam means red, because evidently the dirt, which is also an equivalent meaning or part of the semantic range, was probably red. So red dirt. That's what Adam means, dirtbag. But anyway, when Adam first sees Eve, it is not her differences that he rejoices in, but her sameness to him. She literally had his flesh. The stated purpose of God, and remember, not Adam, but God, was to make someone like Adam. not someone inferior like the animals, who incidentally were made from the dust just as Adam was. Adam didn't consider them, and God didn't consider them his equal, Adam's equal, just because they were made from the same dirt. He only considered Eve his equal because she was made from his flesh. His equal, not inferior, not someone he had authority over, because she wasn't made from the dust. God brought the animals to Adam to show him that none were his equal, not to show him he needed one more subordinate. And besides, which one is it that needs help, the weaker or the stronger, if I were to make that argument? If one wishes to claim that helpers are weaker in spite of all this, then they must say that God, as our helper, which he is weaker than us. There's no escaping this logic without committing a fallacy, and there are people who actually go there. They say, and I think John Piper is one of these teachers, that when God stoops down to help mankind, that God is actually taking a subordinate position. That's how desperate some people are to read male over female hierarchy into Scripture. They would go to the point of making God our subordinate, and that is blasphemy. The inescapable fact is that nothing in Genesis 1 or 2 even hints at any form of hierarchy between one person and another, regardless of their attributes. Neither does the creation account mesh with evolutionary theory, as we saw in chapter 1, or simulation theory, or give us the impression that this is all just an allegory of the struggle between good and evil. This is history, literally, and we must be careful not to read too much between the lines, or on the other hand, to gloss over important details. Let me end this lesson with a statement more on the social or political side of the creation account. Humans have as much mandate from God to multiply and fill the earth as the animals. By what authority does anyone claim that nature can do whatever it wants, but humans should die off because we interfere with it? That's written on the Georgia Guidestones. If you don't know anything about that, look it up. Who can claim moral high ground here? Why should humans, whom God placed in control of and authority over everything else, be reduced to the level of a disease? If you know the movie The Matrix, that's what the antagonist, Agent Smith, called humans. A virus, a cancer. What entity can you think of who hates people more than anything or anyone except God? We'll get into more about that in chapter 3. But when you hear people talk about that humans are ruining nature, ask them by what authority they say that. We are part of the things that God created. We have the right to be here and the right to do with it as we see fit. Now, God also, later on, will explain, no, you can't ruin the earth. That's not only bad but stupid. You depend on it. So Scripture is not giving a mandate for poisoning the earth or being mean to animals. It's just saying we do have authority over them, and we have every right to be here. In fact, it looks for everything we can see in Genesis 1 and 2 that we were the reason the world was made. Just to get rid of that social construct in these modern times that somehow people have no right to be here, and there are people saying this, which again is just no other word for it but stupid. So that river system we've seen seems to still to be something described in terms of our geography as we know it, at least in general. Their courses may have been altered, and they weren't very precisely defined other than general directions anyway. But Eden had rivers in it that came up from the ground and from the paradise and watered at least the Garden of Eden, which apparently was a very large area. But it seems also that God made animals and Adam from dirt outside of that area. So look carefully through the Greek interlinear, look at any version or language of the Old Testament you choose, and see if you can find a problem with the way I rendered the text or with the conclusions I drew from it. I'm not saying I'm infallible, I'm just saying they're plausible from the text. And again, we have to be careful what we read between the lines. That will, as I mentioned, be especially important in chapter 3, and that's when everything goes bad. And we need to study those things for good reasons, and I will get into more of those reasons in the next lesson. Thanks for watching.